10. On Sentimentality and Pleasure. Even more profound and determinative connections unite the doctrine of non-resistance with the substantive roots of the entire teaching. For the idea of love raised up and put forward by Leo Tolstoy brings along with itself such content in all its foundations and conclusions that predetermine the infidelity of almost all of its questions and answers. Love, praised by his teaching, is, in essence, a feeling of empathetic compassion which can be related to some particular individual, but can capture the soul of anyone, immersing it in a state of objective tenderness and softness. It is this feeling, taking root in the soul, capturing its deepest sensitivity and determining the direction and rhythm of its life, which brings to it a whole series of dangers and temptations. So, first of all, this feeling in itself gives the soul such pleasure, the fullness and possible acuity of which only those who have experienced it can know. To experience it is good not only in the sense that it is morally valuable and that it should be experienced, but also in the sense that it in itself gives the soul the greatest gratification, satisfying it and satiating it with this sweetness. In this state, the soul experiences itself blissfully alone, wholly enveloped and dissolved. In it everything flows and courses, it sounds and glows, sings and shines. It finds in itself the source of assuaging the need for other forms of happiness. And moreover, it is a source that cannot be taken away by another's arbitrariness, and compared to which other sources seem meager, weak, and unreliable. But it is this direct accessibility of the key to pleasure, its self-sufficient character, the intensity of the gratification it provides, and especially the ability to play it as an instrument and sing it out with a pointless tenderness which can inconspicuously accustom the soul to spiritually unjustified and spiritually insignificant self-satisfaction, to focusing on this self-satisfaction and on its procurement. This good can bring the soul to heal not by the power of its spiritual superiority and perfection, but by the power of its delightful bliss, and, further, insofar as it can lead to chilling and instinctive aversion from everything that is not this good or that does not lead to it. This can give rise to the practice and theory of moral pleasure, hedonism, which distorts both the force of clarity, the worldview, and the foundations of personal character. The moral hedonist instinctively gravitates towards everything that grants him a state of blissful happiness, and in an equally instinctive fashion turns away from everything that threatens to disrupt, cut off, and extinguish this state. His spiritual eye begins to search and touch upon everything, and quickly turns away or closes as soon as anything perturbing or heinous appears in his field of vision. Irritation, bitterness, and anger are burdensome to him and in him, as feelings that run contrary to the desired bliss, as in others who share his wavering, blissful equilibrium and well-being. Therefore, as if from the instinct of self-preservation, he learns to turn away from evil and indulge in his inner good. Gradually, his spiritual eye adapts and learns to see what is worthy of adoration in everything, and not to see what is truly repugnant. The cumbersome, painful, debilitating experience of true evil is completely dismissed by it and swept away. The moral hedonist does not want this experience, does not allow it to occur in his soul, and as a consequence he gradually begins to not believe in evil and in the chance of its appearance. Realizing this proclivity of his, he formulates it in the form of a rule which recommends to shrink from evil, to overlook and forget about it. According to this rule, everything considered by it begins to be systematically filtered, reinterpreted, and distorted. The moral hedonist does not see what he is really given and sees not what is true. He values in experience not objective fidelity and accuracy, but compliance with his subjective moods and the fantasy that has grown from them. He becomes accustomed to fantasizing his experiences and to experience these fantasies as reality. His outlook on the world thus acquires the features of an idyllic inconsistency. We can now ask clearly how this all reflects on his lessons of life, especially those concerning the question of resisting evil with violence. Only by a misunderstanding can we see in these a teacher and a leader. It is also clear that moral hedonism damages not only the clarity, but also the character of a person. The state of remoteness and dissolution not only fails to include the will, but dismisses it from the outset, declaring it on the one hand unnecessary, and on the other hand restrictive, chafing, and therefore a hindrance to dissolution and fluidity. For the will does not dissolve the soul, but gathers it and concentrates it. It does not immerse it in a boundless, infinite current, but creates a profile and form. It is not pointless, but definitive and definite. It cannot talk to everyone, blissfully responding yes, but also needs to have the option of a solid, justified denial. Therefore, hedonistic tenderness, embracing the soul and capturing its central sense, involves it in a certain weakness of will, expressed in indifference or in direct hostility to all willful impulses and tasks. Love, professed and preached by the affectionate moralists, turns out to be a weak-willed or passively willed state. This love does not strengthen the character by concentrating forces and forging the spiritual center of the individual, but gradually weakens it. It does not formulate a personal spirit, but delights the soul with boundlessness and uncertainty. It disaccustoms the soul from persistent rejection and instead draws it to all-embracing and all-reconciling neutrality. Such weak-willed love is not an active emotion, for emotion is not hostile to the will, but needs it and seeks rapprochement with it. But at the same time, we are not here discussing a passive effect, for the effect at its very depth cannot be causeless, just as a wound is impossible without a wounding arrow. The weak-willed love of a hedonistic moralist is rather a mood, easily muddling along with a lack of both will and objectivity. As a weak-willed mood, this love is sentimental, and as a pointless mood, this love is purposeless. It does not carry within itself a spiritual task or spiritual responsibility. It is a feeling that is saturated with itself. It is not a beginning, but an end, not an outcome, but a finalization, not a step, but an achievement. It is sweet self-worth or the enjoyment of valuing oneself. And he who dwells in himself and does not allow anything external to lead him away from himself, he is declared to be right. Can such a weak-willed and sentimental character consciously extinguish in himself the very genesis of heroism, sweetly sinking in an endless and pointless mood, and consciously asserting its rightness as the only path which is exemplary for all? Can he rise and resolve the heroic problem of resistance to evil? And is it not clear that by solving this problem in his way, he will create a temptation for weak-willed and overworked souls rather than giving strength and wisdom to men who stand on the right path? Further, strange as it may seem at first glance, such love not only fails to bring loving into the lives of other people and does not introduce it into a single, living system of consistency, solidarity, and community, but on the contrary, tears love away from others, contrasts it to them, and fixes this opposition with a kind of philosophically justified, practical indifference to their fate. This characteristic is explained, on the one hand, by the moralistic approach to love, and on the other hand, by its satisfying effect. Morality requires compassion from a person, compels him, and reproaches him for his failure. In this way, it focuses the person's attention on himself, accustoming him to a peculiar, sometimes rather refined egocentrism. A moralizing person is mainly interested, sometimes exclusively, in what he himself experiences and what he does not experience, and, reproaching himself, he tries to introduce into the composition of his personal life new, morally valued experiences. But if he succeeds and begins to experience and persists in the sweetness of sentimental moods, then the developed egocentrism not only neither weakens nor disappears, but is fixed and consolidated in the indulgent soul. This is why, for a sentimental moralist in his moods, it is not the external object, the beloved, who is essential, but he, the loving subject. It is important that I have compassion, and this is morally more important, more valuable, and psychologically more real than the state of that to which I have a compassionate attitude. It is necessary that I feel intensely ashamed, then I will be blissful, and in comparison to this event of the bliss that begins in me, the fate of the desired subject is decisively shifted into the background. It's not that someone suffers. Suffering is even beneficial to people. The point is not that in external relations and affairs of people, something has taken place or something has not taken place. Such is not in the realm of human power, but in God's hands. It's not about the consequences of an act, considerations about which should not weigh at all in the motives and intentions of a person, to such an extent that the act is directly declared all the more morally perfect, the less committedly one thinks about its consequences. The whole point is that I internally fulfill the will of God, that is, to love, and anything beyond this is not in my power and therefore does not inform my goals. This is why the love of a sentimental moralist does not carry his soul from himself to another and does not relieve him of his own burden and personal limits, but on the contrary perpetuates them. A sentimental person does not go into that which he loves, does not identify with his beloved, and does not forget himself. Therefore, he does not construct a favorite object, does not create it, because to do so it is necessary to shift the target center of one's life away from oneself. Such a moralist is centered egoistically, and precisely because of this, his love, as it turns out, is virtually a cadaver. He sings and calls to it, but what he sings is a state of inner self-absorption and practical ineffectiveness. This is love, irrelevant, extensive, and socially listless, indifferent to the consequences of its actions and to the public good. Its slogan is expressed by the words, to leave others to themselves and to live a good life by themselves. A loving subject turns out to be incomparably more important than a beloved object, and it is understandable that at the moment when the sentimental soul has to choose between the two, it, remaining true to its nature and its principles, chooses decisively in favor of the subject and his precious moral correctitude. This does not mean that the sentimental moralist rejects all self-sacrifice and is not in any way capable of it. There are such acute cases when he directly advises to put oneself in the place of the person being killed or to sacrifice one's life. However, with careful analysis, it is found that he sacrifices his life not for the sake of saving his beloved, but for his own righteousness. For, as already established, the answer to the dilemma must bear in mind those cases in which only physical resistance against the oppressor can save the loved one, rather than the offering of oneself as a substitute for the murder victim. If a strong-willed, heroic, unsentimental, loving soul faces the task of saving a loved one from death, or, correspondingly, protecting the family, church, or homeland from attackers and abusers, then he cannot consider such a task to be legitimate if he righteously perishes together with the rescued person, and, moreover, will perish because he did not dare to transgress the limits of his moral righteousness. But the sentimental moralist loves only to the limits of his personal moral righteousness. For the salvation of the beloved, he agrees to give his life as a last resort, but not his moral impeccability. True, he loves, and is ready to defend his beloved, but only until physical opposition, which is morally forbidden to him as a sinful, shameful form of violence, becomes necessary. Therefore, if life puts him before the need to choose between saving the beloved and saving his personal righteousness, he does not mind saving his personal righteousness, at least to avoid the cost of its moral end, and so betrays his beloved. His sacrifice is not on the altar of his beloved, but on the altar of his own moral perfection. This is what determines the limit of his egocentric love. Of course, this is no small thing if a person puts his moral impeccability, as he himself understands it, above his own life. However, it is this devotion to his own virtue that reveals how little he is devoted to everything that is not himself. If an attacker assails a beloved person, and I prefer, at that moment, that they be killed, at least along with me, rather than to put myself in physical opposition to the attacker, then all my love turns out to be an example of affected grandstanding. I discover that my love is limited by my own nature, that these limits condemn it to a kind of practical desertion and betrayal, and moreover, at the most critical moment, that I really do not dare to love selflessly, wholly, and heroically, for fear of sin, and that all my love is a kind of practical indifference to the supposedly beloved object. It is clear that if the emphasis of love lay not on the subject who loved, but on the object which was beloved, then the call to physical counteraction would not be met with an insuperable barrier. The rescuer would save his beloved without reflecting upon a potential sin, without trembling before his potential moral imperfection, because the situation would activate real love and real urgency. He would postpone his own moral trial, and this untimely trial would not, at the hour of decision, plunge him into a duality, a hesitation, a lack of will, and a practical betrayal. It is also clear that sentimental love does not unite people, but divides them. In fact, if each person, following the rule of subjective morality, left others to their own devices, caring only about their own moral sinlessness, then there would arise not a brotherly unity, but the scattering of passive atoms turned away from each other. Everyone would be immersed, each to himself and for himself, into a self-sufficient process of moralizing self-affection, and everyone would realize that at the critical moment of an attack, he would find nothing more than a weak-willed and passive compassion from others, or in the best-case scenario, a willingness to be attacked and slaughtered alongside him. It is difficult to imagine what kind of socially corrupting stream would bring such a perverted, fateful attitude to the life of mankind. If all people answer the call of sentimental morality, stop troubling themselves about external and general matters, and act without thinking about unity, or the consequences of their acts, they will erase from their lives the beginnings of mutual defense, joint action against attackers, and solitary struggles against villains. This is a monstrous program of self-imposed scattering for not only all the good in the world, but also the self-determination and mutual understanding of morally noble souls. And all this from an unreasonable morality, under the name of mutual love. Fortunately for humanity, a spiritually healthy instinct will not allow for such a derailment.